All right, welcome to Friday Night Bible Study through the book of Romans, verse by verse. Excuse me. So I'm going to jump right in as we go through the book of Romans. Again, Romans is going to be a fascinating book, a detailed study on salvation. The biggest takeaway from Romans is you will have an assurance of salvation, your salvation, if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will know why. So, but let's get to Romans 1. We're still in Romans 1, and we're going to be, uh, um, I gotta share my thing here. Okay. So, we left off in verse 18. Oh, okay, verse 18. And it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed." Now, we talked about this last time, God's wrath, and I this is a troubling statement for some because of its eternal consequences. It's eternal. When you think about the fact, I said this before, that when I think about my life, okay, that at 17, the age 17, oh, that's not what I want. At the age of 17, uh, at the age of 17, had I died, that I would have been in hell right now. Would have been in hell right now. And I say that particular time because probably that was probably the most of time that I glorified sin in my life, which I thought it was sin. I actually tried to be miserable, but at that time, I did not want God. I had no desire for God. I wanted sin. So no doubt, had I died, I would have been guilty. Okay, I would have been certainly in full unbelief, rejecting God. And so right now, I would have been in hell. So that's a frightening thought. It's frightening because um, I would have, again, I'd be eternally lost. But here's my thing: it's frightening, but I don't, and I get so far that my mind shuts down. Okay, when I think about what hell could be like, I go so far and I shut down. I understand people's troubled, but here's the thing: you don't have to go. So right here he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven." And a lot of people complain, a lot of people criticize the Bible, and they criticize, and people who criticize this, they would say that God is unjust. There is a movement out called deconstructing. And I'm going to say typically it's atheist, though it doesn't have to be necessarily atheist. But the idea, the goal, the purpose is that there are people in our culture, okay, who have come such aware, and they reject the Bible, they reject Christianity, they reject the God of the Bible, they reject Jesus Christ. And many of them grew up Christian. Many of them grew up in the age of children's church, okay? I say that because I'm old enough to remember there was a time where there was no children's church. Okay, in other words, church, you just went to church and you probably went to Sunday school, but um, the rapid growth of children's church probably came in the late 70s to and in the 80s. Okay, but uh, um, that yeah, but and when you're talking about children's church, anyway, that's neither here or there. But a lot of the people who are now questioning the existence of God, the legitimacy of the Bible, they grew up in that era. And now they've come to the place where they reject it. So they're the ones that will criticize mostly, again, the authenticity of the Bible, the truths of it. And this is one of the things that they will criticize. How can a God of love send people to hell? And it's the biggest question you would always have. How can a God of love condemn people? You know, how if he's a loving God? I told you about the late Carlton Pearson, who in late in his career decided, and this is baffling to me, that he kind of came up with the ideology that there is no hell. He came up with the thought that there is no wrath. No one is going to go to hell. All will be saved because Jesus saved all. So kind of an extreme hyper grace kind of thing there. He lost he lost really everything for that. He was a mega pastor. Um, to say he had the ideal life, to me, that one of the ideal life, he had it. Money, he had a family, money, okay, big church. He had what's called the Azusa Street conferences every year that drew anywhere from 15 to 20,000 people. I mean, as ministry goes, he was on top of the world. It doesn't get better, right? He was a singer, books. He had the audience of the president. Again, that it doesn't get better in terms of if you could say what's the dream life, he had it, and then he kind of just threw it away with the false doctrine. He was labeled a heretic, and truly, rightfully so. And he held that view that there is no hell to the day he died. And um, what's you could tell when people are not genuine about why they believe, because he would never ever talk about verses like this. So in other words, if you start by saying there is no hell, people are not going to hell, God is so loving he's not going to send anybody to hell, then why is this verse here? For God's wrath is revealed from heaven, right? And I'll jump ahead. We're not going to read that, but God took care of it in Jesus, and nobody's going to hell. Not even the devil is going to hell, even though the Bible says it. And I don't know. I mean, he might have. I just haven't seen it where anywhere where he addressed these specific verses. Why did they say what they said? In some cases, he probably tried to come up with, let's go to the Greek, and this is kind of the fallback. Let's go to the Greek and let's do some fancy Greek this, and so the word didn't really mean that and all that. But again, here we have it, for God's wrath. Okay. The problem, of course, is when they say for God's wrath, they question or criticize God's wrath. Okay. What they're not doing is giving all the details. See, they're not giving all the details. So, like in, Pastor Carlton, his thing is he came up with a straw man vision where the reason why he came up with and I think he called it the inclusion that he came up with. Um, he's looking at this late night shows, kind of the shows that they raise money for starving people in Africa. So he sees these starving kids, the bloated bellies, and starving. And as he's looking at this late night, in the wee hours of the morning, he says, "God, why are you sending these people to hell?" Now, that's a straw man question there. Who says he was, first of all? And why would that come up in looking at starving people? I mean, wouldn't the question be, "Lord, how come you're not doing anything to feed these people," right? But he jumped all the way to, for really, as I heard his story, no reason. Why would you send them to hell? And then supposedly God answered him and said, "Is that what you think I'm doing?" It's like, "No, I'm not sending them to hell. There's no hell," right? So that's why I said they develop that whole thing of inclusion, document inclusion. But then why is God saying this here? For the wrath of God is revealed. So here's the thing. Now let's finish the sentence. So, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And this is what the Pastor Carthen was doing. He's actually suppressing the truth. And let me just say this. I don't know if he went to hell or not. I don't know what's going on in his life. But based on, okay, if he held that view, then he's suppressing the truth. But again, I'm going to say he was certainly in the hands of God. And here's why I'm going to say this too. This is a kind of a sidebar. What he was teaching was heretical. And I'm going to get down to this later because I think this is important to kind of understand. That's why I'm careful to say I don't know if he, went to hell or not. And I'm going to say, based upon just simply the fact of what he was teaching about wrath and all that, he still believed in Jesus. He still believed Jesus died on the cross. He just went a step further and said Jesus died for everybody, and they're saved whether they want it or not. Now, again, I know people could say, "Well, you're you're kind of compromising there." No, I'm just saying I don't know what his status is. But based upon this, yeah, he's taught a heretical teaching. Okay. But notice what he says here. For the wrath of God is revealed in heaven against all ungodliness. And here it is. So the wrath of God is not against people who are godly. The wrath of God is not against righteous people. And we're going to later on talk how do you become godly? How do you become righteous? But notice this phrase. He says, who suppress the truth. And so these are actions here. It's not so many times in our culture too, because we have this fake kind of conservative view of Leave It to Beaver where people are right. This century of, you can go back to what was called the 40s, and they thought that was the purest time of America. And then how they pictured it on television through shows like Fathers Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, and others. And you see, the picture perfect husband, wife, and usually 2 children, maybe 3. And everything was always perfect. The hair was always done. The wife was in their place. Husband, worked always an office job. And everybody was nice. And even in the rapture movies, the tribulation movies, the end time movies that Christians produce, they always show that the rapture, they start off with usually a husband or wife. I want to say maybe usually the wife. That's a Christian, and the husband is not a Christian. And then, you know, so leading up to the point in the movie where the rapture happened, the wife is trying to get her husband to go to church. Just go to church with me, honey. And he's like, oh, I don't want to I don't want to, the Christians are hypocrites. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And maybe they show him he goes one time and he's bored and maybe offended, whatever. And then when the rapture happens, he's left behind. And then he's like, oh my God, this happened. It's real. And of course the rapture movies are always hilarious because this is what they think is going to happen if the rapture happened like that people are going to be crying out, why? Come back. Don't leave me, right? Okay. So people think, all right. But here's the point. When you look at their rendition, everybody's really good. You would almost be like, well, he didn't say the sinner's prayer, and that's why he got left behind. Okay. And what we see in Scripture is, notice this, God's wrath. There's only one reason why people face God's wrath in Scripture. Only one reason. Only one reason why people go to hell. Now, some people, again, we've been misled with a lot of tradition, denominationalism, because we think we go to hell because of actions that we do. But you're going to see that the actions are what your nature is. Okay? So notice here, God's wrath is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. That's the problem, is people suppress the truth. So if you go back to Pastor Carlton, and he suppressed the truth because he never talked about the wrath of God. He omitted these verses here. So God's wrath is revealed against the ungodliness of people. So that's who those who are going to, and even if you think lovely, oh, God-fearing God grandma, why would she go to hell? And I get this all the time, by the way, this question all the time. And so people may say, well, you mean to tell me that if, and here is, I'm going to give you one right out of the headlines. In the late 80s, I believe, the late 80s, and maybe the early 90s, there was a serial killer named Ted Bundy. Okay, so he killed numerous women, got caught, and was sentenced to die. Fast forward, that in jail, he came to Christ. So even though he was executed, and he came to Christ. Now, some people may say, well, you mean to tell me that after all of those murders that he did, you mean he's going to go to heaven? But then you would say, well, you mean to tell me that Mother Teresa, now if you know anything about Mother Teresa, if you know anything about the image of Mother Teresa, that what is being, she was a good woman. She devoted her life in giving, in just giving her life, doing good, merciful acts. That's what she was known for, and that's the term Mother Teresa. It's just kind of synonymous with that. A person who just devotes to her life to doing good, helping the poor, feeding the hungry, things like that. She did good, okay? She was just known for that. But the thing is that if she did all of that and then she did not believe in Jesus, so here's the thing. Did she go to hell? Yes. Now you go to Ted Bundy, serial killer, but he finds Christ. Let me give you a story. I mean, the thief on the cross. You go back to Jesus, and you can see this in Luke's account. The Jesus is crucified, and beside him there are two criminals. And this is a perfect picture of this. Perfect picture. So you start off, they're crucified, they're hanging on the cross, and they're criticizing Jesus. They're mocking him. And then as time goes on, one of the thieves begins to really kind of watch Jesus, and it comes to a point where the other one is mocking. He's like, "Hey, you know you're supposed to be the Messiah. Save us and yourself, right?" And then the other thief said, "Hey, you need look. We are both. You need to hush with that. We are criminals. We are up here because we did wrong. He did no wrong." And then he turns to Jesus and he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And then Jesus says to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Now here's the thing. All three died. All three died. The one went with Jesus to paradise, but the other one, he did not go to paradise. He went to hell. He did not. What was interesting is that here you had one who saw, one who saw, okay, one who saw um, Jesus and was changed, he believed. The other one saw Jesus and never changed. So now, for God's wrath is revealed against what? That thief. God's wrath wasn't revealed against the thief that begged Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." All right. So he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who, by their unrighteousness," and get this, suppress the truth. They suppress the truth in themselves, around others. Sometimes you have people that will, out of their hatred for God, try to turn people away from the faith. It's something inside of them. They will be incensed if you were sharing your faith with someone. They suppress the truth. Now, verse 19 says, "Since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them." And this is some, now we're going to get into, I'm going to say this is some kind of deep revelation here, right? "For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made." And then he says, as a result, people are without excuse. They are without excuse. So look at this statement. So God, now oftentimes we will get this question. Okay, how could God send people to hell? So we talked about that, right? And people are upset enough that, God's wrath, so people are going to hell. But then people will throw this one up. What about the person? What about the lost Amazon tribe, 5,000 feet up into the Amazon mountains, who have been hid from modern technology, hidden from the world? They know nothing about the world. Why would God send them? They never had a chance to hear the gospel. They never had a chance to, how can they believe? But notice what Paul is saying here. What can be known about God is evident among them. God has shown it to them. His attributes, his invisible attributes, are clearly displayed by his power. So now let's go back to that Amazon, that prehistoric right? Tribe up there that they know nothing. They have no modern communication, whatever. But you know what's interesting? Why do you find pagan artifacts, pagan rituals with them? So that's another question, right? Why would you find that? Why would you find that they always have some kind of pagan ritual? Why would you say I'm going to worship that? In other words, the people that they are describing, they never come across people that say there is no God. There's no God. It's always people with pagan, right? Pagan stuff. So why is that? Why do you have the pagan stuff? The pagan worship. What would say? So okay, we don't know, right? We're okay. We're just find ourselves right in 2050, 2025, and so somebody stumbles upon them, and they go, "Hey, you guys got a health? You guys got a charger? You guys got a charger?" And they go, "Charger? What's that?" And you look around, and they're living primitive. They're living, but they got pagan practice. Why would you come up with some kind of pagan worship? And that's going to be the case with any pagan worship, right? And during Paul's day, um, oh, I lost it. Okay, here we go. Let's go back. All right, let's see here. All right, so uh, here we go. All right, I kind of lost my feed for a minute, but I'm back on. All right, so got during Paul's time. In fact, during this time, there was a time when the Christians were called atheists. And the reason why they were called atheists because they only worship one God. Okay? And you remember in Acts chapter 17, let me see if I can find this right quick here. Uh, I think I want Acts chapter 17. Okay. Let's see. It is, let's see. Um, Let me find it here. Or is it 18? Let me see. It's got to be 17 here. Paul makes this preaching, and let me find it here. So it's got to be 17 here. Yes, here it is. Um. All right. So let me go back here. Verse 19. It says they took him and well, there's another one I want you to see. Oh, here it is, right here. Verse 16 says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was troubled within him when he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worship God, and in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. Now, just kind of a note. One, Christians, you should know your God, which means you should know your Bible. And you should never be afraid to then reason with people. So notice he said the whole city was full of idols. So then also some of the Epicureans and Stoic Stoic philosophers argued with him and said, "What is this pseudo intellectual trying to say?" And others replied, "He seemed to be a preacher of foreign deities because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection." And so they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and said, "May we learn about this new teaching that you speak of? And for what you say sounds strange to us, and we want to know what these ideas mean." Now, all of the Athenians and foreigners residing there spent their time on nothing else but to tell or hear something new. Okay, and then it says, and Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I see that you're extremely religious and in every respect, for as I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar to which it says, to the unknown God. Now, they were so religious, they were so pagan, and in this particular case here, there was philosophy mixed in. They were so they were so religious that, well, there may be a God out there that we don't know. So we'll put this altar for the unknown God. And they said the unknown God. So Paul said, okay, I'll take it. The unknown God. So he says, therefore, what you worship in ignorance, then I'll proclaim to you. So the idea of paganism now, and I'm going to get to whether or not if the other side can, as Christians, can we be accused of paganism ourselves? Can we be accused of making up our faith? I'll get to that. I'll answer that. But let's go back to the paganism. That the pagan, for sure we know you just make it up. So if you start with the Amazon who knows nothing, where would they get the idea that they can make up any kind of God? You cut a tree down and you make up an idol. And this has been ever since the fall of man, idol worship. But why did they make up idol worship, right? And what Paul is saying right here is that, see, the wrath of God is against that godlessness and unrighteousness, because who told you to make it up? With proof, whatever. Why would you make it up? And then not only do they make it up, but then they suppress the truth in it. So, but God has displayed his attributes in his creation. He's displayed his attributes in his creation. So now let's come to science. Modern day science mixed with modern day atheism, because they kind of go hand in hand, because atheists have latched on to science. And it's a shield, because when you think about evolution, so it's kind of, I'm going to give you, like, we're not going to go deep, but here's an interesting about evolution. So you go back to the 18th century, and you see a lot of the like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Christian Science, and evolution. So they all come out of this era, that time frame in the 1800s. Okay, the 1800s. And what they have in common is the thought was rebelling against organized religion, namely Christianity. That's what they were rebelling. That's what the thought was, rebelling against that. Now, in some cases, like, okay, they just went from bad to worse, right? So in their mind, I'll say in their mind, you're going to leave one line, just start another one. Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Christian Science, okay? But then you had evolution that came out of the same time frame. And again, it was a rebellion. And this would be the one that science would kind of latch on to. The theory of evolution. And then over time, of course, you had even more scientists that would say, well, let's kind of augment it, let's build upon it. So now, what you have in terms of evolution is you have this kind of theory. In fact, you know what? Let me do this. I think I still have some. All right. All right. Let me do this. I'm going to find, because a while ago I did some kind of teachings on evolution. So let me see if I can find this here. If I still have my, here's some of it. Yes, here's some of it. All right. Now, when you look at evolution, okay, when you look at evolution, okay, that is kind of a picture of the universe. Picture of the universe. No, I can't use that. Anyway, y'all can hear my voice then. All right, so this is kind of a picture of the universe. Now, there's something else I want to show right here. So, if you look at this, because I don't know if you can see this real good here, but it's just kind of a snapshot. There's something else I wanted to see. Here we go. This is what I wanted to see right here, right here. So, if you look at this picture right here, the universe, you get to the left and you see what's called the Big Bang. Okay, you got the Big Bang, and how they show it is that from the Big Bang till our modern kind of time is about 14 billion years. Now, remember, this was sort of over a few decades developed. Okay, and like I always say to people, now they kind of accuse us. They accuse us of, kind of being, not smart, but there's a lot of gaps here. So, in other words, and the idea is that the more time they give it, and as you can see the different things here, you got the Big Bang, and then when they say after 3 minutes, I don't know how they look. This is again, this is a person just they kind of just made this up. All these things here. If you look at the top, after 3 minutes, then you got whatever it is that picture is supposed to be, and then after 300,000 years, you got whatever that's supposed to be, and then after 1 billion years, you got stars and all that kind of stuff forming, and then after 14 billion years, you got, as you can see, man on Earth. Okay. Now the problem with that, and I always ask the question. So this is a lot of gaps to say that you have to get to how we are created here. I mean, when you just look at, right, our bodies and how you get to this form here, right? So then let me see how I can do this. Because that, here's what I wanted to do. I want to take a look at this picture here. No, not that. No. I got these pictures right here because when you think about Legos and you look at the one on the side and it's just not put together, and then if you say that the one on the right can just it'll be put together by itself. And then again, I say that because what all of they talking about right here, the universe, the solar systems, and then they're going to tell us that these solar systems form just by natural processes. And think about that. Here you have our sun, and you have all of the planets. By the way, this is obviously not the scale. Okay. And then, but just think about this. How would all these planets form like this? And then, of course, here's the bigger clincher. Out of all of the planets that will form, the third one from the sun, the Earth, is the only one that has the complex life. Okay? So what they want to tell us is that out of all of this, if you start with a rock, right, that a rock will turn into this, right? A rock will form this. Now, here's the thing. They say that because if you give it enough time, you can get from this to this. Okay? Now, that's suppressing the truth. They would rather come up with this than to say God created. That's the atheists, the scientists, they would rather come up. And by the way, I love me some Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he's an atheist. And you have to come up with this. The facts are the facts. But they don't have facts as to how the origins of the universe, they don't know. How can you prove that something happened 14 billion years ago? And by the way, here's my thing. How can you at the very least say, well, God didn't do it? Okay? Whatever the thing is, we know that God didn't do it. We know that God didn't create it. And yet you cannot explain that how we would get from this, a rock, to this, life, billions of life forms on there. That how would we get to that? Right? How would we get billions of life? Okay? So, okay, they go back to this, that it just formed with no logic. So when you look at the universe, remember I said this, when you look at the universe, and I thought I had a better picture of this. I'm going to get some better pictures here. But when you look at the universe here, what Paul is telling us is that God's wisdom, God's power is displayed clearly in this. So now I'll go back to my Legos. That you wouldn't say the one on the right just happened to form that way. When you see the block of Legos and then you see the one on the right, you wouldn't just say that somebody put that together. Now you may not know who, right? You may not know who put it together, but would you really say that it just hopped together like that? And when you think about the complexity, and I am no scientist. In fact, let me say this. I would not sit on a stage with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And if you don't know who he is, he's a popular astrophysicist. But I wouldn't, and he's very, very learned. He's very learned, not only in science, but he studies all kinds of religions and philosophies and all that kind of stuff. He's very well learned. But when it comes to science, I wouldn't sit on the stage with him because I he's going to ask me scientific questions. And our belief, we study a book of faith, not science. And I know that there are Christians out there that try to say, try to prove this the scientific nature of Scripture, and it's not. It's a book of faith. So you get into certain arguments where they're going to say, well, you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, and we know it's millions of years. I can't tell you it either way. Right, I can't tell you all the way all the way. What I can say is that from the God whom I serve, the God of the Bible, making the earth in 6 days is no big deal to him. So I because that's where my faith is. And I'll kind of say this is that the story in Genesis was not designed to be chronological. It wasn't designed to give you scientific facts. It was telling the story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the fact. That's where my faith is. I believe that. If you want to, from an atheist, from a scientific perspective, say, well, I don't believe that. I believe that the earth started with the Big Bang. It takes a lot of faith to even believe that. It takes a lot of faith to believe that from nothing, that complex life could form. The universe, with all of its orbits, can form. You have to say, I believe that's what I believe. You would have to say, that's the possibility that from nothing. And all you have to do is just give it enough time. Let me show you one more thing, then I'll be finished. But if you're going to sit up and tell me that complex life, and by the way, so far, all we know is that it only starts on Earth. We have the complex life. Nowhere else, of all those planets you see right there, like, why wouldn't life begin on these different planets that's indigenous to these planets? Like Martian, right? Like Jupiter, right? Saturn. Why wouldn't there life be there? Why only when people say, well, the processes of life existed on Earth, fine for Earth, but what about the other planets, like Venus, right there? Planet so hot we could not exist on there, for a moment. Okay, but why couldn't there be life that could exist on Venus, life that can withstand the close temperatures of the sun, or the far reaches of Neptune, whatever, how cold it is, that there are creatures that will survive naturally. Why wouldn't it form? Again, I don't mean to get too deep into this, because there is a there again there. So here's my point. When you look at the creation of the earth, when you look at the creation, right? When you look at all of the wonders, okay? You look at all of the wonders. What he is saying is that Paul is saying, God, you can look at that and say, this is some wisdom here. This is some wisdom. This is some, yeah, and the reason why you have this evolution, everything, is the suppression of the truth. That you rather believe that this complexity, right? I often think about this. Why, if without no thought, why do I have two eyes, one nose, mouth? Why do I have all this? Why do I have the male genitals? Why does my wife have the female genitals? What would, if you're saying that if you just let things go by itself, just, okay, it's forming on itself. Why would it form this? Just the logic of it. Why would it form this? Okay. All right. We'll come back to this next week. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. And I'll see you next week on Friday Night Bible Study.